In today's episode, an experienced zookeeper at the Hamilton Zoo in New Zealand accidentally enters the enclosure with the tiger still loose. It isn't long before the tiger's predatory instinct kicks into drive, and a gruesome attack ensues. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying tiger attack on zookeeper Samantha Kudeweh. Welcome to Final Affliction. Samantha Kudeweh was an exceptional woman. The 43-year-old had spent no less than 20 years as a zookeeper, philanthropist, animal rights activist, and she was one of the leading experts on captive breeding programs in the world. She was employed in New Zealand at Hamilton Zoo as the head curator, but she was often called on from across the globe to give her expert consultations to other facilities, hoping to breed endangered species back to their former numbers. Samantha loved every single creature on Mother Earth, but she did have a special place in her heart for rhinos and tigers especially. Some of the first births on New Zealand soil from both creatures were overseen by Samantha personally. Samantha met her husband Richard at a zoo in 2001, and together they had 2 children. Samantha was as devoted to her kids as she was to the animals, and unsurprisingly, the 2 nature lovers were doing a very good job of raising the next generation of environmental fighters who were every bit as in love with the natural world as their parents were. One of their most famous attractions was a Sumatran tiger named Oz. Oz had been brought in a few years ago to support the breeding program, and he was already the proud father of a pair of cubs sired 2 years before. Samantha had a soft spot for him. For one, he was pivotal to the program, and they planned on him fathering as many cubs as he possibly could with the females they had on site, and he was very enthusiastic about the affair. But Oz was also a reasonably well-mannered and chilled-out fellow, for a tiger anyway, and his docile and relaxed nature made it hard not to charm anyone he came across. He knew and understood humans very well for a feline, and given his long life under human care, he certainly tolerated them much more than the other cats on the compound. That week in 2015, the zoo had visitors from Melbourne, Australia. They'd come to observe New Zealand's management of the larger, more dangerous animals, and also to have a look at their breeding program. If all went well, and the first half of the visit certainly looked like it would, then the 2 would collaborate in the future, especially concerning the breeding of big cats. The team began their morning by going around to feed the animals, and for all of the larger carnivores, the setup was the same. They each had a 3-tiered cage. The smaller enclosure was where the animals were led to at the end of every day to sleep. The second, slightly larger holding was for feeding. And finally, the very biggest one was where they spent their days in a space where there were plants and branches, sand pits and watering holes, and a big number of toys around for them to play with. Oz and all the rest went into their middle feeding spaces, and when the rounds came by again an hour later, they were let out to their play and display areas, while the zookeepers came in from behind to clean their sleeping and eating spaces. Every area was securely sectioned off from the next by a heavy snap-lock gate that was impenetrable by an animal once it was shut behind them. Samantha was aware that Oz was not his usual self. September is mating season for Sumatran tigers, and the female in the den next door was starting to show signs of going into heat, and Oz was very much aware of the scents wafting into his enclosure. He'd been pacing nervously up and down his den for weeks. He was unusually agitated and snarled at anyone who walked too close to his fence line. Unfortunately, Oz would have to wait another week or 2 before he could be allowed in with the female, and hopefully he'd get some of that aggressive energy tapered somewhat by the end of the mating season and return to his usual relaxed self in no time. Samantha, even though she was second in command, was not one to stand back and watch everyone else do the work. She was just as likely to pick up a shovel and haul poop around as the newest hires were. That's one of the reasons that her colleagues had so much respect for her in the first place. She never thought that any kind of work, no matter how hard or menial, was beneath her. Oz ate his breakfast, and when the gate opened to let him out to the large space, Samantha stepped in behind him and closed the gate. Unfortunately, something wasn't right with the gate, and it simply bounced off its snap mechanism and did not shut securely. Samantha turned her back on the gate and went over to her wheelbarrow that was loaded with feed for the red pandas. When she turned the wheelbarrow around to exit through Oz's sleeping place, the tiger was already back inside the feeding area. When he walked through the gate, he heard it slam like it always did. But when he turned around, he caught sight of the gate swinging back open, with Samantha walking away with her back toward him. Oz might have never hunted a day in his life, but that didn't mean that he didn't know what to do then. Even with his belly full of food, his hormonal agitation kicked into high gear. He didn't care to hunt Samantha. To him, at that moment, she was a threat to the female next door, and he needed to protect her at all costs, even if that meant taking out the human that had fed him so consistently all of these years. Oz stepped through the gate, tentatively at first, but once he crossed the threshold with the woman now only a few feet from him, he became an orange blur of lightning. Oz crossed the distance in just 4 massive strides before Samantha turned to face him, her hands still on the handles of the wheelbarrow. Oz jumped over the food in one graceful leap. Samantha's eyes went wide with shock when she saw the predator flying at her through the air. But if she had any plans on screaming out for help, there just was no time for any sound to escape her throat. Oz slammed into her, his paws on her chest and his fangs striking her right in the throat. They went sliding across the ground. The force of that drag shredded through Samantha's shirt and tore the skin on her back to ribbons. Oz didn't wait for them to stop moving before he pulled back, ripping the woman's throat completely out. Samantha was powerless to scream with no windpipe and no voice box left to make any sound. The blood spewing from the gaping wound drenched them both in a shower of red. Oz came down on her neck again, but this time he shook his head fiercely. Samantha's neck was broken by the second shake, and whatever life she had left in her was instantly cut off. The moment that Oz realized that the woman was no longer alive, he stepped back from the body. He wasn't hungry, and the threat had been taken care of. So he paced around the enclosure, unsure of what to do now. He sampled at the body once or twice, mostly out of curiosity, until a pair of zookeepers finally came by. They came across a sight out of a horror movie. Oz's entire face, chest, and front legs were covered in blood. He was so drenched that his orange and black stripes weren't even visible, and a few feet from the upturned wheelbarrow lay the crumpled and bloody mess that was Samantha. Even from that distance, they could see that her throat was ripped out and that there was clear damage to one of her legs. The keepers ran to get help, and in less than 5 minutes after the discovery, Oz was lying unconscious in the play area, the tranquilizer dart sticking out of his rump, proclaiming the cause. Samantha's remains were removed from the scene only after police released the body and had taken all of the evidence they needed. Richard, who also worked at the zoo, had to be physically restrained from running into the enclosure when he heard what had happened. This would be the start of a 2-year lawsuit to determine who was responsible for the death of Samantha. The gate hadn't been maintained properly. A little rust and a lack of regular oil caused the gate to malfunction, and Samantha had gone in alone. It should have been implemented that no zookeeper work alone, no matter what species of animal they were caring for, especially since everyone knew what state Oz had been in the weeks preceding the attack. He hadn't eaten Samantha, proving that he acted out of instinctive territorial behavior. Richard resigned from the zoo the day after the attack. There was just no way that he could bear continuing to work at the place where his wife had died so brutally. But he and the thousands of petitioners all agreed that Oz shouldn't be killed. He was acting according to his nature, and no fault could be placed on the animal for doing what he was born to do. But Hamilton Zoo did not have the proper maintenance schedule in place. nor did they require employees to work in pairs, and both of these factors contributed to Samantha's death. In the end, it was decreed that Hamilton Zoo pay the family $200,000, and they were required to overhaul their entire safety, feeding, and maintenance structure, costing them millions of dollars more to meet the standards that were required to keep the zoo open to the public. One thing is certain, Samantha would have agreed with her husband and the petitioners. Oz had every right to live. No one understood more that every Sumatran tiger on this planet is precious and worth saving. Both Samantha Kudeweh and Oz the tiger met their terrifying final afflictions.